Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to continue my series on adapting the board game Source of the Nile, and this time I'm going to talk about generating terrain. So this screen is the same as in previous videos. We have a list of people we can decide to take with us, and it says the terrain outside the city is, in this case it says it's a river running through jungle, and we get to decide whether we want to go on foot, mounted or by canoe once we've picked those, if we want any of them. So let's say on foot because it's simplest, and when we set out, which I'm going to do without buying any of this because just so I can sort of show you more quickly, we see that the terrain is a lake surrounded by jungle. So that sort of makes sense. We followed a river going through jungle and it's sort of widened into a lake. So let's have another one. Same screen. This time it says the terrain outside the city is marsh, which means that we don't have the option of a mounted expedition, only foot or canoe. There's a little explanation down there. And this time when we set out, it says the terrain turns to plains, so the marsh ends fairly quickly. And let's try once more. Again, let's do something that's not marsh. Nope, I'm getting a lot of marsh. All right, a river running through desert. Sounds good. We'll go on foot. And of course, it's still a river running through desert. So let's see the code that allows that to happen. So first of all, let's go through the variables that are going to be most important to us. None of them are new. These are all ones we've done before, but worth refreshing our memory. So first of all, we have $TN for terrain name, and it's a list of the names of all of the different types of terrain. So desert, mountains, marsh, jungle, plains, etc. And then we have $TE, and TE is sort of our map. It's an array that keeps track of the terrain in each area, and separately keeps track of whether there is a river or a lake in that area. So the way it works is $TE, it's a two-dimensional array, $TE1, let's say X, is what terrain exists in area X, and TE2X tells us what sort of water exists in area X. So, for example, if in area 3 it was mountains, then TE13 would have a value of 2 because mountains are the second item in this list. Now, often what we do is instead of looking directly at TE1 something, we go TN square bracket TE square bracket 1 n square bracket something, whatever area we're looking at, n square bracket. So in other words, we look at TE1 something and we see that it's 4, and then we look at TN4, which is jungle. Now, the reason I did it like that is partly because if I change the order of the terrain in TN, I won't have to then alter this code. But the bigger reason and more important reason is that it's easy to see what's being referred to. If you look at this code, you can easily see, oh, it's referring to if the terrain is marsh or swamp. Whereas if it just said if TE10 equals 3 or 7, you wouldn't off the top of your head know that that was a reference to marsh and swamp. So by having the text there, it just makes it easier for me or anyone else who's looking at the code to realise that it's a reference to a given type of terrain. And then TE, so that's TE1Z. It's just going to be a number from 1 to 7. And I've just noticed that is wrong because I've changed the name of one of the variables. But anyway, and $TE2Z is whether there is a river at area Z, or as I've said here, stage Z of the expedition. So if it has a value of 0, there's nothing there. 1 is a river. 2 is a terminal lake, and 3 is a non-terminal lake. Now, those phrases, not terminal and non-terminal, aren't. That's just my personal way of referring to them, and that phrasing only appears in comments. It's not going to appear in the game. And all I mean by it is that a terminal lake is a lake that doesn't have a river running into it. In other words, it's the headwaters of the river. So you go up the river and there's a lake there. And a non-terminal lake is you go up the river, there's a lake there, but the river then flows out of. There's a river flowing into that lake as well. In other words, it's not the source of the river. So, with that in mind, let's have a quick look at terrain. Terrain is the page where it tells you what the current terrain is. So we have if $I is equal to 0, then it says the terrain outside the city is. And otherwise, if TE1I is equal to TE1I minus DI, then it says the terrain is. And otherwise, it says the terrain turns 2. Now, that's just when you're starting the game. I will be equal to 0 when you're in the port. So that's fairly straightforward. What does this mean? Well, $I is where you are. So 3 is 3 areas inland. I haven't yet decided exactly what one area represents in real world terms. I think maybe 10 miles, but I'm not sure. So I is how far inland you are. That's why it's I. And DI is the direction that you're heading. So if DI is 1, you are heading inland. And if DI is -1, you are heading back to port. And by doing it that way, when you move, we just increase I by DI. So if I is 3 and DI is 1, we just add those two together and DI becomes 4. So you move one more area inland. Or conversely, if I is 3 and DI is -1, then we just add those two together and get 2. You're moving back towards the origin of the expedition. So what this code means is, because we add DI to move, that means if we minus DI, that's where you've come from. Except at the beginning of the game where you haven't come from anywhere. But in that case, this will trigger. So if this code ever triggers, that's not the case. So by subtracting DI from I, we could find where the expedition was previously. So what this code means is, if the terrain that you're in is the same as the terrain that you've come from, then say the terrain is. And otherwise, if the terrain is different, say the terrain turns 2. So if you're in desert and you move into jungle, it'll say the terrain turns to jungle. But if you are in jungle and move to more jungle, it'll just say the terrain is jungle. So it's just a bit of a phrasing thing. It just sounds better to say the terrain. To me, it sounded more natural. It's still not quite natural phrasing, and I feel like I'm going to change this a bit more, but it feels more natural to say the terrain turns to mountains or turns to whatever it may be. Then this bit is to do with TE2I, which is the water element. If it equals 0, we just print a full stop. So we don't say there is no river. We just say the terrain is desert, and that means that it's desert with no river. The terrain is jungle. That means jungle with no river. The terrain is whatever, full stop, if there's no water. Otherwise, we say the terrain is, or the terrain turns to, a river running through plains. A river running through TN TE1I. And else, well, if TE2I isn't 0 or 1, then it must be 2 or 3, because those are the only values it can ever have. And so therefore, in this bit of code, we say it's a lake surrounded by desert or whatever it may be. There is a flaw in this system. I will say that you can have a lake surrounded by desert, and I think that doesn't seem quite realistic. But anyway, that's something else I'm going to look at changing. But for now, it says a lake surrounded by whatever the terrain is. So let's look now at the sort of main page that's relevant to this video, which is move. So what move does, most of it is generating new territory. We look at if $I plus $DI is greater than $FI, then we execute all this code that goes down to here. And then we set I equals I plus DI. As I said before, we add 1 or subtract 1 to or from the value of DI to indicate moving further inland or moving back to the coast. And then we include terrain, i.e. we print out, we tell the user what they're travelling through. So most of the code is if I plus DI is over FI. So what does that mean? Well, we've already said I is how far inland you are, DI is the direction you're moving in, FI is furthest inland. It's the how far you explored, not necessarily where you are, because you might be coming back, but it's how far you got. It's the highest value that I ever had. So let's say $I is 3 and $DI is 1 and $FI is 3. Well, that would mean that your 3 areas inland, you're heading inland, and 3 areas inland is the furthest that you have explored. And then 3 plus 1 would be equal to 4, and that would, of course, be greater than 3. So that would tell the computer, as the note says here, we're moving into new territory. We're not returning from something, and we're not... You can set out, head back, and then head out again. You might, because you might... normally you wouldn't, but you might get some loot or something, or change your mind or something. Or you will be able to do that in the complete game. But in this case, we are moving into new territory. And because we're moving into new territory, we don't have a value for the TE slots, and so we have to generate what the new terrain is. And there's 2 parts to that. We generate the terrain, and then we generate whether there's water or not. So the first thing is quite simple. There's a 50% chance that the terrain is the same as the previous area. So desert tends to be next to more desert, jungle tends to be next to more jungle, mountains tend to be next to more mountains, and so on. And that's if random 1, 2 equals 1, so generate a random number which is either 1 or 2, and if you generate 1, then we simply set TE1I plus DI to be equal to TE1I. In other words, the same terrain as before. Not necessarily the same in terms of whether there's a river or a lake, but the same in terms of whether it's jungle or desert. Otherwise, we have to do all the code from... we have to do all the code from there to there. This is the code for generating a new terrain type. So the first thing we do is we set Z equal to TN TE1I. In other words, the terrain where we are now. And if that terrain is either mountains or mountainous jungle, so there's 2 types of mountain terrain. We can have mountains or mountainous jungle, and TE2I equals 1 or 2. In other words, TE2I is a river or a non-terminal lake. 1 is a river, 2 is a non-terminal lake. Then we set TE1I plus DI equal to 2 plus random 0, 1 times 4. So what does that all mean? Well, let's look at this first. If Z equals mountains or Z equals mountainous jungle, in other words, if the current territory is mountain or mountainous jungle, and if we in the current territory have either a river or a non-terminal lake, then we set the next territory, the territory that we're moving into, to be equal to either 2 or 6. And if we look at Tn, if we want to know what 2 or 6 is, we will find that 2 is mountains and 6 is mountainous jungle. So what this code means is if you are exploring into a new territory, and if your current territory is mountains or mountainous jungle, and the current area has either a river or a non-terminal lake, then the new territory must also be mountains or mountainous jungle. Now, why would we do that? Well, it's because if we've got a river or a non-terminal lake, that means the water's going to continue. Because remember, we're exploring upstream and we're looking for the headwaters of this river, and that's always going to be a lake. And let's say we had territory that was something other than mountains. Well, that would mean the river would flow downhill. If you have mountains and then you have plains or desert or anything else, the water obeys gravity and it'll flow down the mountainside. But because we've been exploring upstream, that would mean we have a river that flows down both sides of the mountain, and that doesn't make sense. It would have to have a lake, and then there'd be 2 rivers coming from it, I suppose. But we would, if we followed the river and we said that the river was still flowing, if we were still going upriver, we would end up having a river that was flowing uphill. It was flowing into the mountains from the plains, and so that doesn't work. So we have, if we have mountains and the river hasn't ended yet, because we're still going upriver, we need to have more mountains. I hope that makes sense. It does make sense. I hope I've explained it in a way that makes sense. So there's a special case there. To avoid rivers flowing uphill, if you have mountains or mountainous jungle and you have a river or a non-terminal lake, then the next area has to also be mountains. Otherwise, we just choose a terrain randomly, which is all that means, random 1 to tn.length minus 1. And then we set y equal to the name of whatever terrain we've just generated. And we have a special note here which says that we can't have desert adjacent to jungle. So we say if z equals desert or y equals desert, in other words, if the current territory or the new territory is desert, and z equals jungle or y equals jungle, or z equals mountainous jungle or y equals mountainous jungle, in other words, if at least one of these two is desert and at least one of these two is one of the 2 jungle terrains, well, then we have desert next to jungle. And so instead we set TE1 1 I plus di equal to 5. 5 is plains, so to avoid having desert next to jungle, we just turn the new territory into plains instead. That's all that means. Then, having generated the terrain, we have to generate the water. And for convenience, we set zy and x equal to these values, tn te1i, tn te1i plus di. So the same as we have up here, but because we haven't set z and y in every possible if, we have to do it again here just in case. So z is the previous terrain, y is the current terrain, or z is where we currently are, it's $I, and y is the territory we're moving into, $I plus di, and they are both text, and then x is the previous water situation, $te2i. So, again, trying to avoid rivers flowing uphill. If y equals mountains or y equals mountainous jungle, then we execute, oops, sorry, I've accidentally clicked the wrong page. Okay, so, sorry, I've lost my place. Here we go. So if y equals mountains or y equals mountainous jungle. So this is if the new territory is mountains or mountainous jungle, then we execute this code here. If the previous water was 1 or 2, i.e. a river or a non-terminal lake, then we have a 50% chance of a river and a 50% chance of a terminal lake. So the new water situation is 0 or 1 times 2 plus 1, which will give us a value of either 1 or 3. Now, we do that because we've got this rule that if we've got mountains and a river or a non-terminal lake, then we make the new territory mountains or mountainous jungle. Because rivers can go quite a long time, that would mean the mountains would go for quite a long time, and that would be a bit unfair and also not terribly realistic. So what I decided to do, and we'll see whether it works when we play, is that if you get to mountains, then there's a 50% chance of the river ending in a terminal lake. In other words, once it gets to the mountains, you're likely to find the headwaters, which is, I guess, realistic. If you're following a river and it might be winding through the plains, and then suddenly you find yourself climbing into the mountains, you would probably think, yes, this is probably going to be where the source of the river is. So if the previous area had a river or a non-terminal lake, then we make this one either a river or a terminal lake with an equal chance of each. Otherwise, if the area previous to the mountain had no water or was a terminal lake, then we have no water, because the explorers are considered to be moving upstream when they're going out and downstream when they're coming back. And if you had a river in the mountains, it would of course flow down, and once you left the mountains, and so you'd be going downstream but going inland, and that would be, I wasn't sure what would happen then, because this is meant to be in the hollow earth. Would you end up at another coast? It makes things a bit complicated, so we just say instead, unless we're continuing on a river, we'll just have no water. If the current area is marsh or swamp, or marsh or swamp can't have rivers or lakes because marsh and swamp are themselves water feet, or sort of long. I mean, they're sort of in a way a shallow lake. They're a shallow body of water anyway, and so you can't have a river running through it because, for the same reason, you can't have a river running through a lake. So if it's marsh or swamp, just set the water to 0. Marsh or swamp tends to have rivers flowing into it, feeding it. So if the new area is marsh or swamp, then we say 50% river or 50% nothing. A non-terminal lake is always followed by a river, because a non-terminal lake, we've just defined it as a lake that has a river flowing into it. A river, I've decided that 5/6 of the time it'll be, I've said water, but I meant to say river. I'll fix that in the version that I upload. 5/6 of the time it'll be river still, and then if it's not that, it'll be either a terminal lake or a non-terminal lake. So rivers tend to keep flowing for a fairly long time is the idea. So if random 1 to 6 is less than 6, make the new area have a river. Otherwise, the new area has a random number from 2 to 3. So 2 or 3, which is a terminal lake or a non-terminal lake. Otherwise, if none of that counts, then that means that we have either no lake or a terminal lake. In that case, we have a 1/6 chance of a new river. So if random 1 to 6 is less than 6, set it to 0. Otherwise, set it to 1. And that is the code for generating new territory and deciding whether there's a river or a lake or nothing in it. And then finally, as I said before, we set I equal to I plus di, and then we include the terrain. We report on what you've moved into to the player. And that is my system for generating terrain. The core of it is just that you generate a random terrain, or 50% of the time you just have the same terrain, and 50% of the time you have a terrain randomly. But there is a lot of special cases, right? Like don't have desert adjacent to jungle. We want to avoid rivers flowing uphill. We want to avoid the characters going downriver, but away from from their starting point. And so we have a bunch of stuff to do with mountains and rivers that flows from that, as it were. So I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.